on every continent. Emboldened autocrats are ramping up repression. They're targeting minority groups. They're often flouting international law. Just as disturbing, within democracies, populist appeals grounded in fear and bigotry and resentment have elevated leaders who, once they're in office, have sought to systematically undermine democratic institutions and entrench themselves in power. In my own country, the forces that unleashed mob violence on our capital are still churning out misinformation and conspiracy theories. For those of us who fervently believe in the ideals of democracy, the question is, how do we respond? And if nothing else, recent events should shake us out of complacency. If we want democracy to flourish, we will have to fight for it. We will have to nurture it. We will have to demonstrate its value again and again in improving the lives of ordinary people. And we will also have to be willing to look squarely at the shortcomings of our own democracies. Not the ideal, but the reality of our own democracies.
One of the fundamental principles upon which America's democracy rests, a principle as sacred as a civic value can be.
The ideal of a democracy is universal equality. The ideal of a constitutional republic is individual liberty. A democracy always degenerates into dictatorship, which promises government-guaranteed equality and security, but it delivers nothing but poverty and serfdom for the people it robs and rules. America was founded as a constitutional republic to safeguard the liberties of the people against the tyranny of democracy or of one-man dictatorship. In this century, great strides have been made toward the goal of subverting our republic into a democracy. The foremost tactic of the subverters is subversion of language. By calling America a democracy until people thoughtlessly accept and use the term, the totalitarians have obscured the real meaning of our principles of government.
Among the many writings of John Stuart Mill, the one most likely to have been read by people living today is On Liberty, and the ideas expressed in it taken as most characteristic of Mill's philosophy. Yet this small and plainly written work is often profoundly misunderstood. Although On Liberty has become a symbol invoked against the intrusions of government into people's personal lives or its stifling of ideas, Mill was unmistakably clear that intrusive government was not the object of his concern in this particular essay. He asserted, "The era of pains and penalties for political discussion has, in our own country, passed away." Even a government press prosecution the year before On Liberty was published has not, in Mill's words, induced me to alter a single word of the text. Various other government restrictions Mill dismissed as but rags and remnants of persecution. The government was not what Mill feared, nor what On Liberty was meant to warn against. It was the social tyranny of the majority and the despotism of custom that he opposed in On Liberty. He said, "In England, from the peculiar circumstances of our political history, though the yoke of opinion is perhaps heavier, that of law is lighter than in most countries of Europe, and there is considerable jealousy of direct interference by the legislative or the executive power with private conduct, not so much from any just regard for the independence of the individual as from the still subsisting habit of looking on the government as representing an opposite interest to the public." What then is the subject of On Liberty? Mill says in the first paragraph of that essay that its subject is the nature and limits of the power which can be legitimately exercised by society over the individual. Society, not government. Mill declared, Like other tyrannies, the tyranny of the majority was at first, and is still vulgarly held in dread, chiefly as operating through the acts of the public authorities. But reflecting persons perceived that when society itself is the tyrant, society collectively, over the separate individuals who compose it, its means of tyrannizing are not restricted to acts which it may do by the hands of its political functionaries. Society can and does execute its own mandate, and if it issues wrong mandates instead of right, it practices a social tyranny more formidable than many kinds of political oppression. While society's disapproval is not usually upheld by such extreme penalties as government may have at its disposal, there are fewer means of escape, with social disapproval penetrating more deeply into the details of life and enslaving the soul itself. Mill says in On Liberty, "Our merely social intolerance kills no one, roots out no opinions, but induces men to disguise them, or to abstain from any active effort for their diffusion." Admitting that some rules of conduct must be imposed, both by law and by public opinion, Mill nevertheless thought that the sole end for which mankind is warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of any of their number, is self-protection. On Liberty argued that individuals should be free to do as they like, without detriment to their estimation in the eyes of others. This was, however, an asymmetrical principle, as Mill applied it. To say that people should be free to do as they like, without detriment to their estimation in the eyes of others, is to say that others have no right to express their own opinions, or even to quietly shun those whose conduct they disapprove. This central principle, elaborated in On Liberty, is asymmetrical in yet another way. It becomes clear, especially in the later parts of On Liberty, that Mill's special concern is with the effects of public opinion and customs on the intellectual elite. Customs are made for customary circumstances and customary characters. He says, exceptional people should be exempt from the influence of mass public opinion, but mass public opinion should not be exempt from the influence of the intellectual elite. On the contrary, one of the arguments for the exemption of the elite from the social influence of the masses is that this will enable the elite to develop in ways that can then enable them to exert social influence over the masses. There is always need of persons not only to discover new truths, and point out when what were once truths are true no longer, but to commence new practices, and set the examples of more enlightened conduct, and better taste and sense in human life. It is true that this benefit is not capable of being rendered by everybody alike. There are but few persons, in comparison with the whole of mankind, whose experiments, if adopted by others, would be likely to be any improvement on established practice. But these few are the salt of the earth. Without them, human life would become a stagnant pool.